call. He never brings up corruption except the corruption he wants to bring about. It doesn't take a genius. It doesn't take Albert Einstein to add 2 + 2. It equals 4. In this case, it equals guilt. Now, you're going to have 16 hours to ask questions. You're going to have 16 hours. That's a long time to ask questions. Wouldn't you like to be able to ask about the documents in that 16 hours? Would you like to be able to say, counsel for the president, what did Mick Mulvaney mean when he emailed so-and-so and said such and such? What's your explanation for that? Because that seems to be pretty damning evidence of exactly what the House is saying here. What's your explanation of that, Mr. Sekulow? What's your explanation? Wouldn't you like to be able to ask about the documents? Or ask the House, Mr. Schiff, what about this text message? Doesn't that suggest such as what the president is arguing? Wouldn't you like to be able to ask me that question or my colleagues? I think you would. I think you should. But the backwards way this resolution is drafted, you get 16 hours to ask questions about documents you've never seen. And then you know what's more? If you do decide at that point after the trial is essentially over that you do want to see the documents after all, and the documents are produced, you don't get another 16 hours. You don't get 16 minutes. You don't get 16 seconds to ask about those documents. Does that make any sense to you? Does that make any sense at all? I'll tell you something I'd like to know that may be in the documents. You probably heard more about the 3 amigos. My colleagues mentioned 2 of the 3 amigos, Amigo Volker and Amigo Sondland. These are 2 of the 3 people that the president put in charge of Ukraine policy. The 3rd amigo is Secretary Rick Perry, the former Secretary of Energy. Well, we know from Amigo Sondland's testimony that he was certainly in the loop. He knew exactly all about this scheme. And we know from Ambassador Volker's testimony and his text messages and his WhatsApps that amigo was in the loop. What about the 3rd amigo? Wouldn't you like to know if the 3rd amigo was in the loop? Now, as my colleagues will explain, when we get to the Department of Energy records, that, well, surprisingly, we didn't get those either. But any communication between the Department of Energy and the Department of State is covered by this amendment. Wouldn't you like to know? Don't you think the American people have a right to know what the 3rd amigo knew about this scheme? I'd like to know. I think you should be able to ask questions about it in your 16 hours. At the end of the day, I guess I'll finish with something Mr. Sekulow said. He said, this was a dangerous moment because we're trying to rush through this somehow. It is a dangerous moment, but we're not trying to rush through this trial. We're actually trying to have a real trial here. It's the president that's trying to rush through this. And I have to tell you that whatever you decide here, maybe this is wasted breath and maybe it's already decided, but whatever you decide here, I don't know who the next president's going to be. Maybe it'll be someone in this chamber. But I guarantee you this, whoever that next president is, whether they did something right or they did something wrong, there's going to come a time where you in this body are going to want to subpoena that president and that administration. You're going to want to get to the bottom of serious allegations. Are you prepared to say that that president can simply say, I'm going to fight all subpoenas? Are you prepared to say and accept that president saying, I have absolute immunity. You want me to come testify? Senator, you want me to come and testify? No, no, I have absolute immunity. You can subpoena me all you like. I'll see you in court. And when you get to court, I'm going to tell you, you can't see me in court. Are you prepared for that? That's what the future looks like. Don't think this is the last president if you allow this to happen. That's going to allow this to take place.
Your time
Mr.
has
Justice,
expired.
I yield back. I thank you.
The majority leader is recognized.
To table the amendment
The question is on the motion to table.
and ask for the ayes and nays.
Is there a sufficient second? There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Aye. Ms. Baldwin. No. Mr. Barrasso. Aye. Mr. Bennett. No. Mrs. Blackburn. Aye. Mr. Blumenthal. No. Mr. Blunt. Aye. Mr. Booker. No. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Braun. Mr. Brown. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mrs. Capito. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Cassidy. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Cornyn. Ms. Cortez Masto. Mr. Cotton. Mr. Kramer. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Daines. Ms. Duckworth. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Ms. Ernst. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Gardner. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Ms. Harris. Ms. Hassan. Mr. Hawley. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hyde-Smith. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Jones. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kennedy. Mr. King. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Langford. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mrs. Loeffler. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. McConnell. Ms. McSally. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Paul. Mr. Perdue. Mr. Peters. Mr. Portman. Mr. Reed. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Romney. Ms. Rosen. Mr. Rounds. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sass. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott of Florida. Mr. Scott of South Carolina. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Sinema. Ms. Smith. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Sullivan. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Tillis. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall. Mr. Van Hollen. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Young.
Is there anyone wishing to vote or change their vote? If not, the yeas are 53, the nays 47. The motion to table is agreed to. The Democratic leader is recognized.
Mr. Chief Justice, I send an amendment to the desk to subpoena certain office and management and budget documents, and I ask that it be read.
The clerk will read the amendment.
The senator from New York, Mr. Schumer, proposes an amendment number 1286. At the appropriate place in the resolving clause, insert the following. Section, notwithstanding any other provision of this resolution pursuant to Rules 5 and 6 of the Rules of Procedure and Practice in the Senate when sitting on impeachment trials, 1, the Chief Justice of the United States, through the Secretary of the Senate, shall issue a subpoena to the acting director of the Office of Management and Budget, commanding him to produce for the time period from January 1st, 2019 to the present all documents, communications, and other records within the possession, custody, or control of the Office of Management and Budget, referring or relating to A, the actual or potential suspension, withholding, delaying, freezing, or releasing of United States foreign assistance, military assistance, or security assistance of any kind to Ukraine, including but not limited to the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, referred to in this section as USAI, and foreign military financing, referred to in this section as FMF, including but not limited to 1, communications among, between, or referring to Director Michael John Mick Mulvaney, Assistant to the President Robert Blair, Acting Director Russell Vaught, Associate Director Michael Duffy, or any other Office of Management and Budget employee. 2, communications related to requests by President Trump for information about Ukraine's security or military assistance and responses to those requests. 3, communications related to concerns raised by any Office of Management and Budget employee related to the legality of any hold on foreign assistance, military assistance, or security assistance to Ukraine. 4, communications sent to the Department of State regarding a hold or block on congressional notifications regarding the release of FMF funds to Ukraine. 5, communications between 1, officials at the Department of Defense, including but not limited to Undersecretary of Defense Elaine McCusker, and 2, Associate Director Michael Duffy, Deputy Associate Director Mark Sandy, or any other Office of Management and Budget employee. 6, all draft and final versions of the August 7, 2019 memorandum prepared by the National Security Division, International Affairs Division, and Office of General Counsel of the Office of Management and Budget about the release of foreign assistance, security assistance, or security assistance to Ukraine. 7, the Ukrainian government's knowledge prior to August 28, 2019, of any actual or potential suspension, withholding, delaying, freezing, or releasing of United States foreign assistance, military assistance, or security assistance to Ukraine, including all meetings, calls, or other engagement with Ukrainian officials regarding potential or actual suspensions, holds, or delays in United States assistance to Ukraine. B, communications, opinions, advice, counsel, approvals, or concurrences provided by any employee in the Office of Management and Budget regarding the actual or potential suspension, withholding, delaying, freezing, or releasing of security assistance to Ukraine, including legality under the Impoundment Control Act. C, Associate Director Michael Duffy taking over duties related to apportionments of USAI FMF from Deputy Associate Director Mark Sandy or any other Office of Management and Budget employee. D, all meetings related to the security assistance to Ukraine, including but not limited to interagency meetings on July 18, 2019, July 23, 2019, July 26, 2019, and July 31, 2019, including any directions provided to staff participating in those meetings and any readouts from those meetings. E, the decision announced on or about September 11, 2019, to release appropriated foreign assistance, military assistance, or security assistance to Ukraine, including but not limited to any notes, memoranda, documentation, or correspondence related to the decision. F, all draft and final versions of talking points related to the withholding or release of foreign assistance, military assistance, or security assistance to Ukraine, including communications with the Department of Defense related to concerns about the accuracy of the talking points, and G, all meetings and calls between President Trump and the President of Ukraine, including documents, communications, and other records related to the scheduling of, preparation for, and follow-up from the President's April 21st and July 25th, 2019 telephone calls, as well as the President's September 25th, 2019 meeting with the President of Ukraine in New York. And 2, the Sergeant at Arms is authorized to utilize the services of the Deputy Sergeant at Arms or any other employee of the Senate in serving the subpoena authorized to be issued by this section.
Mr. Chief Justice,
The Majority Leader is recognized.
first, a scheduling note. As the parties are ready to debate this amendment, I suggest we go ahead, get through the debate, and vote before we take a 30-minute recess for dinner. And I would remind everyone that I'll be moving to table the amendment, and it's also important to remember that both evidence and witnesses are addressed in the underlying resolution.
Thank you. The amendment is arguable by the parties for 2 hours, equally divided. Mr. Manager Schiff, are you a proponent or opponent of the motion? Proponent. Mr. Cipollone, are you a proponent or opponent? Then, Mr. Schiff, your side will proceed first, and you will be able to reserve time for rebuttal. Thank you.
Before I begin, Mr. Chief Justice, the House managers will reserve the balance of our time to respond to the counsel for the President. Mr. Chief Justice, Senators, counsel for the President, and the American people, I am Jason Crow from the great state of Colorado. The House managers strongly support this amendment to subpoena key documents from the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB. These documents go directly to one of President Trump's abuses of power, his decision to withhold vital military aid from a strategic partner that's at war to benefit his own personal re-election campaign. But why should that matter? Why should anybody care? Why should I care? Before I was a member of Congress, I was an American soldier, serving in Iraq and Afghanistan. And although some years have passed since that time, there are still some memories that are seared in my brain. One of those memories was scavenging scrap metal on the streets of Baghdad in the summer of 2003, that we had to bolt onto the side of our trucks because we had no armor to protect against roadside bombs. So when we talk about troops not getting the equipment that they need when they need it, it's personal to me. To be clear, here we are talking of $391 million of taxpayer money intended to protect our national security by helping our strategic partner, Ukraine, fight against Vladimir Putin's Russia, an adversary of the United States. But the president could not carry out this scheme alone. He needed a lot of people to help him. And that's why we know as much about it as we do today. But there is much more to know. And that's what trials are for, to get the full picture. We know there's more because President Trump needed the Office of Management and Budget to figure out how to stop what should have been a routine release of funds mandated by Congress. A release of funds that was already underway. But the people in this chamber don't need me to tell you that, because 87 of you in this room voted for those vital funds to support our partner, Ukraine. Witnesses before the House testified extensively about OMB's involvement in carrying out the hold. It was OMB that relayed the president's instructions and implemented the hold. And it was OMB that scrambled to justify the freeze. OMB has key documents that President Trump has refused to turn over to Congress. It is time to subpoena those documents. These documents would provide insight into critical aspects of the military aid hold. They would show the decision-making process and motivations behind President Trump's freeze. They would reveal the concerns expressed by career OMB officials, including lawyers, that the hold was violating the law. They would expose the lengths to which OMB went to justify the president's hold. They would reveal concerns about the impact of the freeze on Ukraine and U.S. national security. And they would show that senior officials repeatedly attempted to convince President Trump to release the hold. In short, they would show exactly how the president carried out the scheme to use our national defense funds to benefit his personal political campaign. We are not speculating about the existence of these documents. We are not guessing what the documents might show. During the course of the investigation in the House, witnesses who testified before the committees identified multiple documents directly relevant to the impeachment inquiry that OMB continues to hold to this day. We know these documents exist, and we know that the only reason we do not have them is because the president directed OMB not to produce them, because he knows what they would show. To demonstrate the significance of the OMB documents and the value they would provide in this trial, I would like to walk you through some of what we know exists, but which the Trump administration has refused to turn over. As we have discussed, the Trump administration has refused to turn over any documents to the House in response to multiple subpoenas and requests. Based on what is known from the testimony and the few documents that have been obtained through public reporting and lawsuits, it's clear that the president is trying to hide this evidence because he is afraid of what it would show. The documents offer stark examples of the chaos and confusion that the president's scheme set off across our government, and they make clear the importance of the documents that are still being concealed by the president. We know that OMB has documents that reveal that as early as June, the president was considering holding military aid for Ukraine. The president began questioning military aid to Ukraine after Congress appropriated and authorized the money. $250 million in DoD funds and $141 million in State Department funds. This funding had wide bipartisan support because, as many witnesses testified, providing military aid to Ukraine to defend itself against Russian aggression also benefits our own national security. Importantly, the president's questions came weeks after the Department of Defense already certified that Ukraine had undertaken the anti-corruption reforms and other measures mandated by Congress as a condition for receiving that aid. So there is a process for making sure that the funds make it to the right place and to the right people, a process that has been followed every year that we have been providing that security assistance to Ukraine, including the first 2 years under the Trump administration. Nonetheless, the president's questions came days after DoD issued a press release on June 18th, announcing it would provide its $250 million portion of the taxpayer-funded military aid to Ukraine. According to public reporting, the day after DoD's press release, a White House official named Robert Blair called OMB's acting director, Russell Vought, to talk about the military aid to Ukraine. According to public reports, Mr. Blair told Vought, quote, "We need to hold it up." OMB has refused to produce any documents related to this conversation. The Senate can get them by passing the amendment and issuing a subpoena. But there's more. The same day Blair told Vought to hold up the aid, Michael Duffy, a political appointee at OMB who reports to Vought, emailed Deputy Undersecretary of Defense Elaine McCusker and told her that the president had questions about the aid. Duffy copied Mark Sandy, a career official at OMB, who told us about the email in his testimony before the House. Like all others, that email was not produced by the Trump administration in the House impeachment investigation. We know this email exists, however, because in response to a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit, the Trump administration was forced to release a redacted email consistent with Sandy's description. But OMB provided none of those documents to the House. With this proposed amendment, the Senate has an opportunity to obtain and review the full record that could further demonstrate how and why the president was holding the aid. These documents would also shed light on the president's order to implement the hold. On July 3rd, the State Department told various officials that OMB blocked it from dispensing $141 million in aid. OMB had directed the State Department not to send a notification to Congress about spending the money. And without that notification, the aid was effectively blocked. Why did OMB block the congressional notification? Who told them to do it? What was the reason? The Senate would get those answers if it issued this subpoena. But there's more. On July 12th, Blair, the White House official who had called Vought on June 19th and said, quote, "We need to hold it up," then sent an email to Duffy at OMB. Blair said, quote, "The president is directing a hold on military support funding for Ukraine." We haven't seen this email. The only reason we know about it is from the testimony of Mark Sandy, the career OMB official who followed the law and complied with his subpoena. As you can see from the transcript excerpt in front of you, Sandy testified that the July 12th email did not mention concerns about any other country or any other aid packages, just Ukraine. So of the dozens of countries where we provide aid and support, the president was only concerned about one of them, Ukraine. Why? Well, we know why. But OMB has still refused to provide a copy of this July 12 email and has refused to provide any documents surrounding it, all because the president told OMB to continue to hide the truth from Congress and the American people. What was he afraid of? A subpoena issued by the Senate would show us. OMB also has documents about a key series of meetings triggered by the president's order to hold the military aid. In the second half of July, the National Security Council convened a series of interagency meetings about the president's hold on military aid. OMB documents would show what happened during those meetings. For example, on July 18th, the National Security Council staff convened a routine interagency meeting to discuss Ukraine policy. During the meeting, it was the OMB representative who announced that President Trump placed a hold on all military aid to Ukraine. Ambassador Bill Taylor, our most senior diplomat to Ukraine, participated in that meeting. And he described his reaction at his open hearing.
In a regular NSC secure video conference call on July 18th, I heard a staff person from the Office of Management and Budget say that there was a hold on security assistance to Ukraine, but could not say why. Toward the end of an otherwise normal meeting, a voice on the call, the person was off screen, said that she was from OMB, and her boss had instructed her not to approve any additional spending on security assistance for Ukraine until further notice. I and others sat in astonishment. The Ukrainians were fighting Russians and counted on not only the training and weapons, but also the assurance of U.S. support. All that the OMB staff person said was that the directive had come from the president to the chief of staff to OMB. In an instant, I realized that one of the key pillars of our strong support for Ukraine was threatened.
It's hard to believe that OMB would not have any documents following this bombshell announcement. It surely does. It was the agency that delivered the shocking news to the rest of the U.S. government that the president was withholding the vital military aid from our partner. And we would see these documents if the Senate issued a subpoena. The July 18th meeting was just the first in a series of meetings where OMB held the line and enforced the president's hold on the aid. But there was a second meeting on July 23rd, where we understood agencies raised concerns about the legality of OMB's hold on the aid. And then a third meeting at a more senior level on July 26th. Witnesses testified that at that meeting, OMB struggled to offer an explanation for the president's hold on the aid. And then a fourth meeting on July 31st, where the legal concerns about the hold were raised. At each of these meetings, there was confusion about the scope and the reasons for the hold. Nobody seemed to know what was going on. But that was exactly the point. All of the agencies, except OMB, which was simply conveying the president's order, supported the military aid and argued for lifting the hold. OMB did not produce a single document providing information about its participation, preparation, or follow-up from any of these meetings. Did these OMB officials come prepared with talking points for these meetings? Did OMB officials take notes during any of these meetings? Did they exchange emails about what was going on? Did OMB discuss what reasons they could give everyone else for the hold? By issuing this subpoena, the Senate can find out the answers to all of those questions and others like them. The American people deserve answers. OMB documents would also reveal key facts about what happened on July 25th. On July 25th, President Trump conducted his phone call with President Zelensky, during which he demanded a favor. This favor was for Ukraine to conduct an investigation to benefit the president's re-election campaign. That call was at 9 a.m. Just 90 minutes after President Trump hung up the phone, Duffy, the political appointee at OMB who is in charge of national security programs, emailed DOD to, quote, formalize, end quote, the hold on the military aid. Just 90 minutes after President Trump's call, a call in which the president had asked for a favor. That email is on the screen in front of you. We have a redacted copy of this email because it was recently released through the Freedom of Information Act. It was not released by the Trump administration in response to the House's subpoena. In this email, Duffy told the DOD officials that based on the guidance he had received, they should, quote, hold off on any additional DOD obligations of these funds. He added that the request was, quote, sensitive, and that they should keep this information closely held, meaning don't tell anybody about it. Why did Duffy consider the information sensitive? Why didn't he want anyone to learn about it? Answers to those questions may be found in OMB emails that we could all see if you issue a subpoena. But there's more. Remember, the administration needed to create a way to stop funding that was already underway. The train had already left the station. And something like this had never been done before. Later in the evening of July 25th, OMB found a way, even though DOD had already notified Congress that the funds would be released. Here is how the scheme worked. OMB sent DOD a funding document that included a carefully worded footnote directing DOD to hold off on spending the funds, quote, to allow for an interagency process to determine the best use, end quote. Remember that language. To allow for an interagency process to determine the best use. Let me explain that. The footnote stated that this, quote, brief pause would not prevent DOD from spending the money by the end of the fiscal year, which was coming up on September 30th. OMB had to do this because it knew that not spending the money was illegal. And they knew that DOD would be worried about that. And they were right. DOD was worried about it. Mr. Sandy testified that in his 12 years of experience at OMB, he could not recall anything like this ever happening before. The drafting of this unusual funding document and the issuance of the document must have generated a significant amount of email traffic, memos, and other documentation at OMB. Memos, email traffic, and documentation that we would all see if the Senate issued a subpoena. So what was the result from the series of events on July 25th? Where was Mr. Duffy's guidance to implement the hold coming from? Why was the request sensitive? What was the connection between OMB's direction to DOD and the call President Trump had with President Zelensky just 90 minutes before? Did agency officials communicate about the questions coming from Ukrainian officials? The American people deserve answers. A subpoena would provide those answers. OMB documents also would reveal information about the decision to have a political appointee take over Ukraine funding responsibility. The tensions and chaos surrounding the freeze escalated at the end of July when Duffy, a political appointee at OMB, with no relevant experience in funding approvals, took authority for releasing military aid to Ukraine away from Sandy, a career OMB official. Sandy could think of no other example of a political appointee taking on this responsibility. Sandy was given no reason other than that Mr. Duffy wanted to be, quote, more involved in daily operations, end quote. During his deposition, Sandy confirmed that he was removed from the funding approval process after he had raised concerns to Duffy about whether the hold was legal under the Impoundment Control Act. Needless to say, OMB has refused to turn over any documents or communications involving that decision to replace Mr. Sandy. Why did Duffy, a political appointee with no relevant experience in this area, take over responsibility for Ukraine funding approval? Was the White House involved in that decision? Was Sandy removed because he had expressed concerns about the legality of the hold? By August 7th, people in our government were worried. And when people in the government get worried, sometimes what they do is they draft memos. Because when they're concerned about getting caught up in something that doesn't seem right, they don't want to be a part of it. So on that day, Mark Sandy and other colleagues at OMB drafted and sent a memo about Ukraine military aid to Acting Director Vaught. According to Sandy, the memo advocated for the release of the funds. It said that the military aid was consistent with American national security interests. It would help to oppose Russian aggression, and it was backed by strong bipartisan support. But President Trump did not lift the hold. Over the next several weeks, OMB continued to issue funding documents that kept kicking the can down the road, supposedly to allow for more of this, quote, interagency process. While inserting those footnotes throughout the apportionment documents stating that the delay wouldn't affect the funding. But here's the really shocking part. There was no interagency process. They made it up. It had ended months before. They made it up because nobody could say the real reason for the hold. In total, OMB issued 9 of these documents between July 25th and September 10th. Did the White House respond to OMB's concerns and recommendation to release the aid? Did the White House instruct OMB to continue creating a paper trail in an effort to justify the hold? Who knew what and when? OMB documents would shed light on OMB's actions as the president's scheme unraveled. Did the White House direct OMB to continue issuing the hold? What was OMB told about the president's reasons for releasing the hold? What communications did OMB officials have with the White House around the time of the release? As the president's scheme unraveled, did anyone at OMB connect the dots about the real reason for the hold? The OMB documents would shed light on all of these questions, and the American people deserve answers. I remember what it feels like to not have the equipment you need when you need it. Real people's lives are at stake. That's why this matters. We need this information so we can ensure that this never happens again. Eventually, this will all come out. We will have answers to these questions. The question now is whether we'll have them in time, and who here will be on the right side of history.
Mr. Sekulow?
Mr. Chief Justice, the House managers reserve the balance of our time for an opportunity to respond to the President's argument.
Thank you. Mr. Sekulow?
Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice, members of the Senate. Manager Crow, you should be happy to know that the aid that was provided to Ukraine over the course of the President's administration included lethal weapons. Those were not provided by the previous administration. The suggestion that the Ukraine failed to get any equipment is false. The security assistance was not for funding Ukraine over the summer of 2019. There was no lack of equipment due to the temporary pause. It was future funding. The Ukraine Deputy Minister of Defense, who oversaw U.S. aid shipments, said the hold came and went so quickly, they did not notice any change. Undersecretary of State David Hale explained the paused aid was future assistance, not to keep the Army going now. So the made-up narrative that security assistance was conditioned on Ukraine taking some action on investigations is further disproved by the straightforward fact that the aid was delivered on September 11, 2019, without Ukraine taking any action on any investigation. It's interesting to note that the Obama administration withheld $585 million of promised aid to Egypt in 2013. But the administration's public message was that the money was not officially on hold, as technically it was not due until September 30th, the end of the fiscal year. So they didn't have to disclose the halt to anyone. Sounds like this may be a practice of a number of administrations. In fact, to the president, this president has been concerned about how aid is being put forward. So there have been pauses on foreign aid in a variety of contexts. In September of 2019, the administration announced that it was withholding over $100 million in aid to Afghanistan over concerns about government corruption. In August of 2019, President Trump announced that the administration and Seoul were in talks to substantially increase South Korea's share of the expense of U.S. military support for South Korea. In June, President Trump cut or paused over $550 million in foreign aid to El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala because those countries were not fairly sharing the burdens of preventing mass migration to the United States. This is not the only administration. As I said, President Obama withheld hundreds of millions of dollars of aid to Egypt. To be clear, and I want to be clear, Ambassador Yovanovitch herself testified that our policy actually got stronger under President Trump, largely because, unlike the Obama administration, quote, this administration made the decision to provide lethal weapons to Ukraine to help Ukraine fend off Russian aggression. She testified in a deposition before your various committees that, and actually I felt that in the 3 years that I was there, partly because of my efforts, but also the interagency team and President Trump's decision to provide lethal weapons to Ukraine, that our policy actually got stronger. Deputy Assistant Secretary Kent, his name's come up a couple of times, agreed that javelins are incredibly effective weapons at stopping armored advance, and the Russians are scared of them. Ambassador Volker explained that President Trump approved each of the decisions made along the way, and as a result, America's policy towards Ukraine strengthened. So when we want to talk about facts, go to your own discovery and your own witnesses that you called. This all supposedly started because of a whistleblower. Where is that whistleblower?
The House managers have 35 minutes remaining.
Mr. Chief Justice, at war, time matters. Minutes and hours can seem like years. So the idea that, well, it made it there eventually just doesn't work. And yes, the aid was provided. It was provided by Congress, this Senate, and the House of Representatives with the President's signature. The Congress is the one that sends the aid. And millions of dollars of this aid would have been lost because of the delay had Congress not actually passed another law that extended that deadline to allow the funds to be spent. Let me repeat that. The delay had jeopardized the expenditure of the money to such an extent that Congress had to pass another law to extend the deadline so that the money and the equipment got to the people on the front lines. Need I also reiterate the supposed interagency process, the concerns that the President and his counsel continue to raise about corruption and making sure that the process went right. There was no interagency process. The whole thing was made up. It was a phantom. There was a delay, and delays matter. Mr. Chief Justice, I reserve the balance of my time for Mr. Schiff.
Mr. Schiff?
Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice. Just a few additional points I'd like to make on this amendment and on my colleagues' arguments. First of all, Mr. Sekulow makes the point that the aid ultimately got released. They ultimately got the money, right? Yes, they got the money after the president got caught, after the president was forced to relieve the hold on the aid, after he got caught, yes. But even then they had held on to the aid so long that it took a subsequent act of Congress to make sure it could all go out the door. So what, is the president supposed to get credit for that, that we had to intervene because he withheld the aid so long? And that's the only reason Ukraine got all of the aid that we'd approved in the first place? My colleagues have glossed over the fact that what they did was illegal, that the GAO, an independent watchdog agency, found that that hold was illegal. So it not only violated the law, it not only took an act of Congress to make sure they ultimately got the aid. This is supposed to be the defense to why you shouldn't see the documents? Is that what we're to believe? Now, counsel also says, well, he's not the first president to withhold aid. And that's true. After all, counsel says, well, President Obama withheld aid to Egypt. Yes, at the urging of members of Congress. Senators McCain and Graham urged that aid be withheld, and why? Because there was a revolution in Egypt after it was appropriated. That wasn't something that was hidden from Congress. That was a pretty darn good reason to think, do we still want to give aid to this government after this revolution? We're not saying that aid has never been withheld. That's absurd. But I would hope and expect this is the first time aid has been withheld by a president of the United States to coerce an ally at war to help him cheat in the next election. I think that's a first. But what we do here may determine whether it's the last. And one other thing about this pause in aid, right? The argument, well, no harm, no foul. Okay, you got caught, they got the aid. What's the big deal? Well, as we heard during the trial, it's not just the aid. I mean, the aid is obviously the most important thing. As Mr. Crow mentioned, without it you can't defend yourself, and we'll have testimony about just what kind of military aid the president was withholding. But we also had testimony that it was the fact of the aid itself that was so important to Ukraine, the fact that the United States had Ukraine's back. And why? Because this new president of Ukraine, this new untested former comedian, president of Ukraine, at war with Russia, was going to be going into a negotiation with Vladimir Putin with an eye to ending that conflict. And whether he went into that negotiation from a position of strength or a position of weakness would depend on whether we had his back. And so when the Ukrainians learned and the Russians learned that the President of the United States did not have his back, was withholding this aid, what message do you think that sent to Vladimir Putin? What message do you think it sent to Vladimir Putin when Donald Trump wouldn't let Vladimir Zelensky, our ally, in the door at the White House, but would let the Russian foreign minister? What message does that send? So it's not just the aid, it's not just when the aid is delivered, it's not just if all of the aid is delivered, it's also what message does the freeze send to our friend and, even more importantly, to our foe. And the message it sent was a disaster. Was a disaster. Now, you might ask yourself, because counsel has said, hey, President Trump has given lethal weapons to Ukraine. You might ask yourself, if the president was so concerned about corruption, why did he do that in 2017? And why did he do that in 2018? Why was it only 2019 that there was a problem? Was there no corruption in Ukraine in 2017? Was there no corruption in Ukraine in 2018? No. Ukraine has always battled corruption. It wasn't the presence or lack of corruption in one year to another. It was the presence of Joe Biden as a potential candidate for president. That was the key change in 2019. That made all the difference. Which gets back to one of the key moments in this saga. You know, a lot of you are attorneys. You're probably much better attorneys than I am. And I'm sure you had the experience in cases you tried where there was some vignette, some conversation, some document. It may not have been the most important on its face, but it told you something about the case that was much larger than that conversation. For me, one of those conversations was not on July 25th between President Trump and President Zelensky, but on July 26th, the very next day. Now, you may have watched some of the House proceedings, or you may haven't, and people watching may have seen it, maybe they didn't. But there's this scene in a Ukrainian restaurant, a restaurant in Kyiv, with Gordon Sondland. Now, bear in mind, Gordon Sondland, who said there was absolutely a quid pro quo and 2 + 2 = 4, this is not some never-Trumper. This is a $1 million donor to the Trump inauguration, okay? If there's a bias there, it's clearly a $1 million bias in favor of this president, not against him. So there's a scene in Kyiv, in this restaurant, and Sondland has a cell phone, and he's sitting with David Holmes, who is a career diplomat, U.S. diplomat in the Ukraine embassy. And Gordon Sondland takes out his phone and he calls the White House. Gordon Sondland holding for the White House. Gordon Sondland holding for the president. And it takes a while to be connected, but he's connected to the president. That's pretty impressive, right? This isn't some guy with no relationship to the president. The president may say, Gordon Sondland, I barely know him, or something to that effect, but this is a guy who can pick up his cell phone. He can call the president of the United States from a restaurant in Kyiv, and he does. And the president's voice is so loud that David Holmes, this diplomat, can hear it. And what does the president say? Does he say, how's that reform coming in the Rada? How's the attack on corruption going? No. He just says, is he going to do the investigation? Is Zelensky going to do the investigation? And Sondland says, yes, he'll do anything you want. He loves your ass. This is the extent of the president's interest in Ukraine, and they go on to talk about other things, and then they hang up. And David Holmes turns to the ambassador and says, in language which I will have to modify, to remove an expletive, says something along the lines of, does the president give a blank about Ukraine? And Sondland says, no, he doesn't give a blank about Ukraine. He only cares about the big stuff, like the investigation of the Bidens that Giuliani wants. This is a $1 million donor to the Trump inaugural. admitting the president doesn't care about Ukraine?